Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv, and this time I'm speaking with Ken Sweeney, who is a presenter, co-presenter and producer of many different podcasts, including The Comfortable Spot, which we will talk about at another time, a co-presenter of Lydia's Booktastic podcast, which for anyone out there who's interested in reading, specifically for the younger ages, I think that is an essential podcast, and many, many others. Thanks for speaking with me, Ken.
Thanks, it's a pleasure. I'm not usually on this other side of the microphone, so this is a new experience for me.
That's fine. We'll try and keep it nice and comfortable for you. Oh dear,
Yeah.
I got that in.
You got that pun in early. That's good.
So what's your history then in broadcasting and podcast? How did you get started?
Kind of by accident. Following what happened with the referendum vote in Scotland, I was really fascinated by what was happening with Facebook and social media. Twitter was a little bit still in its infancy, so kind of Facebook was ruling the roost at the time. And what I found was that people were talking a lot about, situations like the referendum in Scotland, but there were so many people talking at the same time that a lot of good conversation was being lost. So what happened was I decided to look at an idea of taking the original concept of the Tumblr blog and building it into a purpose-built website where writers and thinkers, not necessarily leading writers and thinkers, could have a platform to write articles. So we came with this idea called Europe United. It was basically we're publishing articles every week. And these were by, people who were academics or either just people who were social commentators and so on. And after about 2 or 3 years, it was beginning to build up. It was getting quite a big following and I had a lot of people writing for it from all over Europe. But what I found was that I was losing kind of control over what I wanted it to go. I felt that we needed to branch out into other forms of media. So I suggested the idea that we start doing podcasts. As it turned out, at that time, there was the European elections, which was around 2018. So I went and got a grant off the Irish government. It was this thing called Communicating Europe, which gave you a grant of a few grand where you can, do a project based around something to do with Europe and something to do with Ireland, which of course where I am. So we did this project where we did a number of podcasts on the European elections, and it ran in conjunction with articles as well. And that's how it happened. Like, I have a fair bit of experience in the music business. I would have spent the vast majority of my 90s, doing a lot of backup work, production work and backing solo singing stuff, all that kind of thing, songwriting, because at the time in Ireland, there was a big build, a burgeoning pop music scene. It Boys Own, Westlife, all that kind of thing. So you had cynics like me just, doing it purely for the money and, writing stuff or trying to, get stuff produced or published so that we could get other people to go up and make a show themselves singing on. So that's where I got my experience from. But it was mostly analog stuff. I had a fair idea of Cubase, but, by the time it got to 2018, that whole scene had completely changed. So I knew I had to do the podcasting. I knew I was the one that could do it, but I didn't really know how to do it. So what I did was I went with the most basic form and just bought myself a Zoom H6, which is one of those portable, digital recording units. And I said, okay, going to do it this way. And that's how it started. We started, our first podcast was actually in the media center in the European Parliament, the actual building itself, the European Commission, which was very nerve-wracking because I just basically walked around this very busy promenade where you'd have lots of people that you would know if you're into that kind of thing, grabbing them and saying, hey, if you got 5 minutes to do an interview, flashing them this card and saying, I'm from an media platform in Ireland called the European Union. Oh, Ireland, yeah. So, within the space of 5 minutes, we had 3 or 4 people, in this round table conversation. And I did it with my colleague Stella, who was involved in the organization as well. And she was gang. She came from the music business side. She was trying to get into radio. So for her, it's really suited her at the time. And, after like an hour, we just looked at each other and said, holy hell, we've actually just done our first podcast. And we did a podcast that would have scared a lot of people. If somebody had said to me, by the way, today you're going to do a roundtable conversation with, various MEPs talking about the situation regarding the European elections, I would have said, no way am I going to do that. But we just did it. So, that's how we got into it. So what happened was then we did, an entire series of that ran for about 12 or 13 podcasts. We were bringing in various politicians and so on. And it was a great learning curve for me, because what I had to do was I had to take whatever was on the H6, because I was using the H6 in my office as well.
Yep.
And I went on to Thomann.ie or whatever they're called in Thomann Europe, and bought myself like 4 microphones for 25 quid in this case. They were rip-offs of the SM58s.
Yep.
Plugged them in, used them, and it just worked fine. Because I had once I got that on my head around the modern editing, which in turn turned out to be simpler than when I was using it. So it was a lot easier. So I said, I didn't need to go out and buy any of the Adobe platforms. They all cost way too much money. So I used the basic Audacity, and I just said, grab that. It was very simple to use. And I just began to edit and record them, so I get people on. At the time we were using not using Zoom, we were using those different other platforms, Clean Feed and all those type of platforms. So I was still finding my way, what was the best. And, we finished that whole series, and I really developed everything by the time of the end, how to just record, edit, and produce and publish podcasts. And I really since then, I've been keeping it to the same format, which is just keeping it very simple. So, throughout the last couple of years, then we've done various different podcasts, which we'll probably talk about at a later stage. But what I tend to do is I tend to say, I lose interest real quick. I kind of say, I can't do the same podcast for the next 5 years. That would kill me. So what I tend to do is I set myself a target. I say, okay, we're going to do 10 episode series of this concept. So I can, by the time it gets to the 10th episode, some other new ideas come up in my head. So I can say, okay, it's time to go, rather than saying, Jesus, I have to keep doing this all the time. So that's really my goal. I'm very itchy when it comes to stuff like that. But so that's where we are, and like the organization has morphed into another organization called the European Network, but we still do a lot of podcasts. And I like the concept I have is that I do like to work with other people, but I don't generally work well in a team. But I love having, say, somebody who's a co-presenter or co-researcher. That idea works well with me. And, it's been like that since then. We've had a lot of ideas, which I can probably reveal today, a few exclusives. But the concept is to just keep going. So do a set of podcast series, then pick up a new idea and run with that as well. And I think for me, it keeps my podcast interests going, because I don't have to get worried about whether or not I have to continue this. So for me, it's keeping the buzz going, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things there that you mentioned, just in passing, the throwing yourself in at the deep end, shall we say, for that first time. It's those sort of moments that actually stand out in some ways, because I remember that my first ever episode of this, it was thrown on me in a sense, because I was preparing to start the podcast, and then the person who was going to be the first guest, I sent him the bullet points, like, and everybody knows that I do these points just that we follow to get the basic gist. And he sent me a message back, and this was like 2 weeks before I was due to start. And he said, I'll start the Zoom chat now and we'll get it done now.
Oh, okay.
2 weeks before I was ready, you see. So here's me preparing. So that's one that jumped out at me from that. And then the 2 weeks later, when I actually started officially recording them, on the first day when I did 5 shows in one day, one of those shows was somebody who, for a living, he actually is one of the managers of a big entertainment group. And so he interviews people like, Tarantino, Clint Eastwood, all these people. And so to me, this was like a big thing, getting this guy onto the show. And then there was a back and forth from him. And then he said, oh, I can't make it. About 15 minutes before the time, he said, I can't make it for that time. I'm going to have to push it back an hour. And I said, yeah, okay, that's fine. And then about half an hour later, he sent me a message back saying, can we do it now? And you've got 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, right, okay. So, but it's these moments that, because that put me into that position, then I had to make sure that I stuck to what was rigidly there and got what was needed, as opposed to going off on too many tangents, shall we say. And I had to stick to that. And in a way, it's that learning curve that you get, that you constantly, as you keep doing it, the more and more that you learn.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I think if you're going to do a podcast where you're going to interview people, this is an argument that I find all the time online, especially when people are discussing how they do this. I'm very much a stickler for a script. In other words, giving them something in advance so it prepares them. I guess I get that from doing debates. I've done a lot of debates, live debates on table debates and so on. And, you want the topics to be given to the people who are going to be your guests in advance. So they're not stumbling over the words, or they're not dwelling on something too long. And I find if you can do that with podcasting, you get a much tighter podcast. You're not sitting there waiting for them to think about something. And I find it depends on who you do it with. Like, for example, if you do musicians, authors, or say writers, or anybody like journalists particularly, they're grand. They love that. Sometimes then you might say our more artistic people don't like that. They tend to say, it tends to give them too much room to say, oh, I don't really want to do that topic, or I don't. So you kind of experience kind of brings you into a notion where you say with a particular type of person or in a particular type of industry, you know who you're going to try that tactic with. And then sometimes you might just say, I'm going to leave that tactic. Like politicians, for example, they look like they're going to, no matter what you give them, no matter what questions you give them, they're not probably going to ever give you the answers that you want. So you have to be prepared to follow up. So I always find, my questions, if I'm talking to politicians, the second question is more important, which they don't know. And they never will know until they give me the answer. I know that they're going to give me one of two answers, and I have an answer, but I have a repeat question based on those two answers. So I think you're right. It's, some people would say, oh no, I don't like giving them anything at all. But I think if you're not well known, or if it's the first time you contacted somebody about this and you just out of the blue, they've never heard of your podcast, you have to give them something, I think, because they might get just a bit too suspicious. They might think this might be somewhere there's a gotcha moment. Yes. Because that's happening nowadays with real life, So I think you have to give somebody a bit of leeway, and you have to give them something in return if they're going to give you an hour or two time. It's only fair, I think.
Yeah, but also if they don't know what they're coming into from the off, you run the risk of it going wrong seriously. Because I was only watching earlier on completely different, but I was watching an interview earlier on, or a clip from when they were interviewing Tom Cruise. And this person, who's an Australian interviewer, suddenly went off script and started asking him about his relationship with one of his ex-wives. And it's like,
I've seen
even me, I watched it and I'm like, that is just so wrong. You do not do that. You don't go into those areas. There was no reason for the interviewer to go there. And that could easily cause the end of that conversation altogether, understandably.
Yeah. Or the career of the interviewer.
Yeah.
Look, this is a crazy move. I've seen that video myself, and I tend to send that to some of my friends when they're asking me about doing a podcast. This is how you not do it. It's up there with the top 10. Do not do it for an interview. And I think the issue there is that some of Australian media is very heavily based on UK media. Yep. So they love getting those gotcha moments. It's the news of the world type of thing. And there are certain people that you can tackle with on that. And then there are other people who you just cannot go that way. And personally, I would do anything to have an interview with Tom Cruise.
Yes.
I can tell you this up straight.
Yep.
None of my interview would be about his personal life. I actually don't care about that.
No.
I only had a conversation today about Top Gun. Somebody's seen Top Gun, and they were saying, yeah, but you got to look at him. He's a bit mad and all that kind of thing. And I said to him, I completely removed that from him, because at the end of the day, he entertains me. That's his job. He does a damn good job of entertaining me. So if I was going to interview Tom Cruise, believe me, I'd have a long list of questions, and they would be all about how he entertains me, because I think my listeners would want to have those questions.
Yeah.
So, I think it's crazy. You waste a great opportunity, don't you?
Yeah, you waste a great opportunity to do a deep dive in that situation and get some behind the scenes of some of his best films. I, who've never done that sort of interview or chat, even I would know that. I'll look at, so I'll discuss Rain Man, I'll discuss Born on the 4th of July, I'll go into this area, that area, the other area, and I won't want to touch any of that private side whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Or why has he not decided to do anything like, say, Netflix movies or anything like that? Is he the last of the great matinee stars? Those people who are untouchable, and no matter what, they don't go below the certain line within the movie making business. Yeah, it's like you did a great interview with Martin Ware, didn't you?
Thank you.
From Heaven 17. Yeah, and I loved that interview. And it was great because I was listening to that because, first of all, I'm a massive fan of Sheffield New Wave stuff.
Me too.
Be it Human League, BBC or Heaven 17. Now, I always loved Heaven 17 because I always thought they were having a laugh while they were doing it. The other two are really serious, you know. You'd Martin Ware and I can't remember. It's gone out of my head.
Glenn Gregory.
Glenn Gregory, yeah. Glenn Gregory always reminded me of the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. Just a constant grin, this constant don't let him near your sister, you know, this kind of thing. He just had that cheeky look in his eye that always looked like, how the hell have I ended up doing this? But I just love it. And I loved Martin and I loved Ian Craig Marsh because they look like nutty scientists and behind the whole thing, and they just look great. They didn't actually give a damn about their Duran Duran kind of image. You know, the lads they look like yuppies, you know, from a Channel 4 movie. Yeah, they just played fantastic music. And I love that interview you done with him because he looked like the type of guy that you could just have a beer with.
Yeah. And so to go behind the scenes with that one is that I think you probably heard I probably left it on the show that I suddenly did a pivot on the show where what happened was that I realized that I was in a situation where I didn't want to just do, shall we say, a standard show and just look at his show, because I thought it was too important to miss his history and his importance in the history of music. So I thought, sod it, I'm going to go there, and eventually that will lead into, because it is the history of the show, essentially. That's how it came about, that he's be able to do this. So I thought, I'll go for it, and that's what I went for. Really proud of it.
No, it was brilliant. Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's brilliant. And you know, I got the chance to interview Midge Ure, and I had to be very careful about how I was going to do this. I know, all my experience came into play. You know, I had to take this kind of moment and just put it in the box, you know, and like it happened to me, and I knew I had, say, 5 seconds to get that emotion out of me and them over the questions. So I sent them over the topics and questions, and I'm sure you heard it, I went with a very specifically interview, looked at one of his best albums as a band, Ultravox, one of his best albums solo, how the production came about with Band Aid, rather than tell us all about Band Aid, because, you know, he's been asked that questions a million times. But what I wanted to find out more of the actual technical side of how the actual song was produced, the actual single. And then I looked at, you know, various other things like, you know, what's he doing recently? How does he feel about reunions and stuff like that? So I was kind of had to be very careful about that. I knew I had an hour, so I knew I listened to a lot of other podcasts that he'd done. I forgot about all the interviews on TV and stuff. They were they weren't looking what I'm for. So I wanted to listen to other people who are obviously interviewing, who are same boat as me. And I tried to, you know, stay away from what they've done. So, so it started like just this here. The Zoom call came on. I saw his face. Every childhood emotion came back. I just literally, my fist went 5 seconds, took a breath and just went for it. And, you know, that's the best advice that I think I can give to people who they do get the opportunity through podcasting to interview somebody that they really wanted to interview, is don't take it like a machine gun and try and hit every spot. You know, pick 2 or 3 important aspects that you think you can sympathize with your guest about. And then that's all about doing your research. Like, for example, I did my research and I knew that Midge generally had very favorable thoughts about, you know, their second Ultravox album that he did, Rage in Eden, because I'd seen it that, you know, the whole tour that they did in 2008 was related around Rage in Eden. So I knew he'd like to talk about that, you know. And then I said, based on that, I kind of have a very slight question about the album that he did with Ultravox that he was probably not so fond of, which was their final album. But I didn't dwell on that. I didn't ask him, you know, this or that. I just left it at the one question and moved on. So I think if I was going to give advice to people about interviewing somebody, as I said, that they really wanted to interview, is try not to let the moment take over. Get your moment, maybe have a conversation if you can with the guest before you do the recording. That can be a couple of days beforehand or whatever. Get that out of your system. And then once you get that out of your system, you can do a good interview. But if you let the emotion take over, what's going to happen is you're going to start going off, script and asking those questions like, where's your favorite jacket? You know, because, you know, stuff like that. That jacket you wore in that video, have you still got it? Because that's, you know, that you're stepping into fanboy stuff. And that can either be great or it can go horribly wrong.
Yeah. Midge, do you still own the trench coats that you wore on the Vienna video?
He does, and it's in a museum, as far as I know, along with his grey Stratocaster, which he played on Live Aid. But you see, I already did my research. I looked through his Twitter feed going back 4 or 5 years, and I said, okay, there it is. Any questions on gear is not going to come into play. And actually, I know a fair bit about synthesizers and stuff like that. I've got a lot of experience with that. So I could have gone down that road, but I knew I'd lose a rack of listeners if I did that. Suddenly, it would just become techno, and before and I don't mean techno as in the music genre. I mean technical. We'd end up start talking about MIDI and more Moogs, and it would just go away, and I'd lose tons of people. They'd listen to 5 minutes of that and go away. So no, that's been done already as well. So no, it's definitely not a goer. That's one of my don't do when you're doing an interview with people.
Well, by approaching that subject, by approaching Midge in that way, I thought one of the interesting pulls from that was the information you got on the like you said, the production of Band-Aid itself and the actual creation of the backing track. I thought that was fascinating because, I mean, I'd heard before that it was all Midge anyway, and then it was all brought in. But to actually get Midge to say that and then go into real detail in how he honed that and got that to that sort of standard before taking it into the studio and then all that, I thought that was fascinating. And I thought that was a great get, really, of an interview and information.
Well, you see, I think the whole thing about Band-Aid / Live Aid is that people just associate Bob Geldof with the whole process. And there's no mistaking the fact that Geldof, as a musician and a songwriter, is pretty damn good. I mean, over here in Ireland, he's still considered a bit of a legend. Yeah. So as being an Irish person, I didn't generally have any interest in that because it's been done already. Whereas I felt that the story behind the actual production of the song itself is a little bit lost. It also, like, the one thing, the thing I got away from it was that Midge did all the instruments, bar Collins banging away on his drums, which Phil Collins would obviously have to do, him being Phil Collins. It's like, if Phil Collins walks into the room in the 1980s, there's no bargaining with the guy. So sometimes that can go horribly wrong, as we saw him do further on in Live Aid with Led Zeppelin. But, these are things that I'm sure Midge would like to talk about. Well, because it's something probably I would like to talk about. And I think, again, with that, it was just looking at a slightly different angle and answering questions for people that maybe have always thought about who wrote the song, what way was the song written, so on and so on.
Hey, it's the boys from Soft Spoken, and we are so glad that you are listening to our new friend Marv and his podcast, Pods Like Us.
Yeah, we were recently on the show for a couple of episodes, and we really enjoyed it. And if you'd like to catch a little bit more of us with all the raunchiness and sauce-based humor that you're used to, feel free to check us out on our show. But in the meantime, keep enjoying Pods Like Us with Marv.
We enjoyed talking with Marv as much as we hope you enjoy listening to him.
Now back to the show.
Absolutely. So, we've gone on to a show that we're going to speak about some other time. And that, for anyone listening, that is one of the standout episodes for me of The Comfortable Spot.
Thanks very much. It's great.
So for anybody out there, then, here we go. Let's get your brain working.
Okay.
What shows do you actually produce?
Right. Well, there's a few I've done. Obviously, the one I did was it was called Eurochat. That is available. All of these are available. I'm going to start with the European network, right? So all of these are available on the European network. If you just search it on any of your favorite podcast platforms, you'll find it there. So we had Eurochat, which was from 2018 to around 2020. Then we did a podcast series which was dedicated to another conference which was happening in Europe last year. It was supposed to happen in 2021. It happened in 2022 because of COVID. It was called The Future of Europe. Now, I'm not necessarily a fanboy of the European Union or anything like that, but obviously, I'm quite interested in the structure of it. So what we did was we did a podcast series called The Future of Europe, but we looked at kind of the other things that weren't being brought up in this conference. Because when these conferences get together, be national, international, whatever it is, Tory party, Labour Party, Democrats in America, or SDP in Germany, they always come up with the same ideas, the big think tanks, climate, population growth, immigration, all of those things. So I tried to look at this idea from a slightly different concept. For example, Europe is a hodgepodge of languages. So we did a podcast on language. And we just didn't talk about languages, but we picked an idea of saying, well, let's look at the Irish language, because it's a really good example of how it is beginning to flourish under the concept of the European Union, which is kind of weird. It shouldn't really, but it's doing better now since it's been in the European Union than it did in the 50 years of Ireland being an independent state. Now, there's a million reasons for that. But at the end of the day, the money that's going into that is helping it, because it means that the languages are being modernized. So we looked at that as a basis of talking about other minority languages, be they Welsh or be they, from Lombardy or Brittany languages or Basque. So that was one episode we did. So you'll get the idea if you go and have a listen to the podcast. It isn't, please let me tell people, it's not a pro-EU. It's just conversations about things that people will have to deal with or are currently dealing with in Europe. And Europe, it could be Britain, it could be Iceland, it could be Cyprus or whatever. So that's the idea I came up with. Like, for example, we talked about people from non-European countries living and working in the European Union and what are the advantages and disadvantages of them. For example, one disadvantage is that if you come from another country and you go to live and study in Germany, education is 100% free.
Okay.
Which is amazing,
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. So it's not free in Ireland. It's supposed to be, but they have these admin fees that come into 20 or 30,000. It's not free in the UK.
No.
It's certainly not free in the United States. So, these are things that we wanted to examine. So as a student, if you're going to go to Europe to study, Germany should be on top of your list. But the disadvantage of that is that you have to learn German. You have to be pretty good at it too, because not only do you have to learn it to be in class, you also have to learn it from an administration point of view. Because if you go into Germany and try and get your social security card, if you don't speak German, they're not going to speak English.
No.
This is not, the tourist section of Berlin. This is somewhere, might be Saxony or somewhere like that. That's where your university is. You're on your own. So these are the type of things that we tried to bring up within the podcast, and discuss on a bigger way. So that ran for about 10 episodes, 15 episodes. And then I did one podcast, which I'm really proud of actually. And I'm really proud of it actually in the current light. A friend of mine, her name is Laura Dana, and she's from Moldova. She got in touch with me about publishing an article which was featuring interviews with 5 or 6 young people who live in Moldova. Yeah. And I thought, okay, that's a good idea. So as I thought about it while talking to this girl, I said, you know what? I said, it's a terrible idea to publish it as an article. I said, because you're going to record these people. So why don't we just do a podcast on it? Yep. So to sum up, what we did was we took all 6 of those interviews and we set them up in a separate episode. And then I played the host and the idiot in the room who doesn't know anything about Moldova.
Yep.
And then she was the expert. So we discussed the topics that were raised in each interview. But what really amazed me was she got such a fantastic array of young people. So like she had, for example, one person who was a musician, a classical musician. Then we had another person who was a young doctor. We had a young journalist. And we had, we had somebody who worked in social media, who was a social media influencer. So she really captured all of the modern kind of array of young people. And I think that for me, that was probably my proudest production I've done so far, even more than what I'm doing now, because it was a concept that I had. And I said, this concept should be used more, because what happens is I think sometimes you have a case where, people do an interview and then they discuss it with 2 experts. They're an expert, the other person's an expert, and they discuss an interview that they've done with somebody else. Yep. But I think if you really want to capture, so you've got 3 people you need to capture. So with the Moldovan coffee break, we had people in Moldova. Then we had Europeans who knew nothing about Moldova. And then we had Europeans who knew a good bit about Moldova. So what we did was we tried to capture all of that and bring it into one podcast. So it was only six episodes. They were 45 minutes long. They were really well put together. Sure, she was amazing. Her English was fantastic, and for me, it's probably the most successful one we've had so far. It won an award with Rode, the company that do all the podcasting equipment. They liked it. So it was on a few shortlists for awards as well. And, I'm really popular with that. I'm really fond of that one because I think it was just an idea that came together by chance and it could have gone one way, but I said, no, I tried to bring it. My idea was to try and bring it all into one and try and do more than just have an interview and a conversation. So I think it worked pretty well. And I like the name as well, too. The whole idea is people sit down and have a coffee. So, I think it worked pretty well. So then the other one I did was with my daughter, Lydia. That's just another world. Lydia would hear me doing the podcasting, and she said to me when she was about 7, I'd love to do podcasting. She's always been a crazy book reader. She'd read a book quicker than I ever could. Yep. So I said to her, well, what would you like to do? And she said, well, I'd like to talk about books on my podcast. So I said, okay, you can review books. I said, what about that? And she said, yeah, that's a great idea. So what I did, Marv, I went online, like I was kind of, I'm good at, I always feel the worst thing you could do when you have a podcast idea is that you suddenly realize that 2 or 3 people have it out there as well. So I said, right, I'm going to check this. So I looked up children's book review podcasts, and I came across 2 types of people that do it. A, mothers and fathers who have kids, and B, teachers, right? Okay. So, and every single one of them are adults. There was nowhere I found, I'm sure it's probably changed now, but 2 years ago, you could not find any podcast where kids were talking about kids' books. And they have them on YouTube, kids review toys and stuff like that, but not as a podcast. I think it's because people kind of assume that podcast is kind of an adult toy for a lot of people. They want to close the door on the family and do their podcast. But what I found, 2 things worked for me about that podcast. A, it introduced Lydia to technology without flooding her brain with it. So she's used to now, she knows how the process works. And B, it enabled her to kind of get more involved in a hobby that she already enjoys. So we don't have a deadline to it. We don't kind of say, okay, we have to do this podcast every Saturday at 9:00, because she's a kid and she likes to do her own things. And sometimes there might be a gap between, say, each podcast of 2-3 weeks. And then we might do a roll of, 1 every week. So I kind of just leave it like that. I let it be a moment where it's a kind of a moment where we can just have some fun together. And of course, I play the absolute idiot. I deliberately don't read the books. So she has to kind of tell me what the books are all about. And, we just have fun with that. They can be all types of books, and she just loves reading comics, magazines, novels, whatever. And, I think that's working. It's probably something I probably need to do more with. But I want her to probably just get a little bit older, maybe. And so she can kind of get the feel for podcasting herself and kind of dictate the way she wants the podcast to go more than me. Because I'm an adult, and I generally, although I have, my own 2 daughters, and when you're around your kids all day, you kind of become a kid in some ways. But I still don't really understand kids. And, I still don't know what they really want to do. So I want to give Lydia a couple of years to kind of develop that and come back to me and say, well, here's how I want my podcast to go. And that may be involving YouTube or, something like that, or TikTok. I don't know. But for the moment, it's a great chance for me and her just to get together. And I love doing it. It's great fun. And, that's where we are. It's 2 years on. I still get as much enjoyment out of it. I have a 6-year-old daughter, Lucy. I've no doubt in my mind she's going to come in at some point and boot me out. So it's going to be Lydia and Lucy's, book review. And that'll be fun then, Then you're kind of been retired, but I can be like, Brian Clough on the sidelines, So yeah, that's where we are. I mean, I do have a new project. I don't know whether you want to hear about that.
Go ahead. Go on.
Well, we've got this very exciting project, and I think it's pretty exciting because I don't think it's been done before. What we've done is we've looked at, women generally in podcasting. And I felt that there isn't enough women in podcasting, actually. And sometimes the podcasts that women who are doing podcasting, they seem to be copying off each other. So, I felt I wanted to do a podcast that was for women, actually, but not have me involved in any of the, the presentation of it, because I'm a middle-aged bloke. So, if you're going to do a podcasting about women, there's no point in having a 50-year-old guy talking about it. So what I decided to do is got this team together. We've got 5 girls, including Laura Dana, who was involved with the Moldovan Coffee Break. And we're taking a similar concept to the Moldovan Coffee Break, but we're talking to 6 women from Greenland. And we're going to talk to them about life in Greenland, living in Greenland, working in Greenland. Yep. We've got 6 different people from different walks of life there. And we're just going to present the podcast then in a very similar way to the Moldovan Coffee Break, except I won't be obviously doing it. We've got 2 great young journalists. We've got a Danish-Irish journalist who has done the interviews already. And then we have another Irish girl who's pretty good at podcasting. She's going to take the role that I took in the Moldovan Coffee Break. And we're going to do something similar to that. And I think it's important because everyone, a lot of people have opinions about this country, this Greenland. It's either somewhere so far away that people just know it exists, or either people have opinions on it and saying, oh, it's part of Denmark. So we're just trying to change that and trying to give people an insight into the country. And, women are great for that because they're great people that are talking about, not about themselves. Because you know that yourself, us fellas are terrible. We just end up talking about ourselves a lot. And so we felt that it was an opportunity to promote women and promote especially women in regional areas like this, because that country's going through a change. It's either going to go one way or the other in the next 20 or 30 years because it's being heavily affected by climate change and so on. So that's where we are. That's probably going to get that out around September. But I think that's going to be, something that I'll be again proud of. Actually, even though I will probably only have my name on it, just, nobody will know even I'm doing it. And I'm very happy with that. So that's kind of me moving into production rather than just presenting and production as well. So that's where I am. And then I have the comfortable spot. Anybody can, that's the easiest podcast series I've done. It's just me talking to people I really like and admire, and it comes very easy to me, so maybe we can talk about that again, and you probably have a load of other questions you want to ask. So I'm waffling on a bit there.
That's fine. I mean, you know that I have a load of questions ready for when we do talk about the comfortable spot.
Yeah. Probably talk about that again.
In passing, since you started the Booktastic podcast with Lydia, there are a couple of actual podcasting groups who do shows that are particularly for the younger listener. And one that jumps out at me is a company called Message Heard, or Message. I'm trying to say it with the H because I'm Northern. I can't say H's. And they do interesting shows like, what is it, The Old Man in the Boat, and that's sort of like almost like an educational show at the same time as being fun, and it's fictional as well, and all sorts of shows like that. So if anybody's actually looking for shows that are specifically for the younger audience, because I think that's an audience that needs to be looked at a bit more, because like you said, it's not seen, because podcast is seen as sort of like an adult thing, for adults to listen to this and that. And I think if you're taking the old style radio approach, they have had kids radio shows before. So why not expand the podcasting so that you make shows that are specifically for the younger listener as well? And I think that's a great idea. You could even have something like Why Don't You, which we remember as kids, you could have something like that that's just kids doing kids things on a show for kids. So there you go.
I think probably YouTube has done damage to that, the development of children being involved in podcasting, either presenting or being a major part of a series, because for YouTube the visual aspect of kids doing things is much more attractive. Kids love YouTube as well, so it's easy for them. Like, they can just go onto their tablet or laptop or whatever, and they can find YouTube really quickly. And color imagery is very important to children. It excites them, it gets them motivated. So I think podcasts for kids is a hard sell. So as you say, what I decided with the podcast that I'm doing with my daughter is that I'm there as well as her, so that the way I saw it is it's 15 minutes, at most 15 minutes long. Yep. So I imagined a 7-minute, car ride to the school in the morning, and then a 7-minute car ride home from the school. So that's the whole idea, so that the mother will shut the kids up in the back. They're screaming and shouting. They're fighting over sandwiches. Kids, put this on. Lydia's podcast is on. It's ready now. There's a new episode. Keeps them quiet and it keeps them entertained. And then they're finding out about books. And then on the episode coming back, the next part, they come home and, they can listen to the second part of it. So that's how I looked at it, because I suppose it kind of has to be that family thing. You have to get moms and dads and kids to sit down and listen together, because kids they're not technically drawn towards podcasting. They're drawn towards YouTube. They're drawn towards CBBS or wherever that, and the CBBS apps and stuff like that are available. So if you're going to get them into podcasting, I think it has to be a family affair, which is why I thought, rather than Lydia do it on her own, or rather than me do it on my own, I think it's better than I'm kind of like the dopey dad and she's the expert. Yeah. And it kind of, Lydia's great and her dad's an idiot. So that's the whole idea. But the mums and dads are listening to it and they're going, they're taking notes. I better get that book in the library or whatever. And that's how it works. So I think you have to have something. If you're going to bring children into podcasting, it has to be something that is, goes beyond what they're maybe used to, something that's different.
Yep. But you also with that, I mean, we don't want to linger on this for too long. This subject we want to carry on with, because, like I said, I mean, eventually, hopefully, we'll look into that more at another date. But it hits the mark in another way where it's a bite-sized show. Essentially, like I said, it gives you what you need, doesn't stick around for too long, tells you gone on to the next thing, and it's got that sort of almost like old style children's television approach where when we were younger, you'd have programs that were on from 4 till 4:45 or thereabouts, and they would be 5 to 15 minutes at the most, long programs that followed on from each other.
Yeah, and we tried the longer concept and it didn't work because what happened was I found out, about 5 or 6 episodes in that Lydia's friends were listening to it, and they were drifting away after about 10 minutes. And I realized, I said, that's perfect. It's like gold dust feedback. When Lydia comes into me and she has 5 or 6 of these besties that she hangs around with. They're like something now, the cookie crew. There's 5 or 6 of them. They're all from different backgrounds and they're all different. 2 of them are not even Irish, and it's perfect. It's the ultimate demographic. And I said to them, what do they think of your podcast? Then you interviewed that famous author. They didn't really care. They just wanted to hear the da. And then, me making an idiot of myself. And then when it goes into the interview with the famous author of a very famous book they all know, they drifted off after 5 minutes. So if we are going to do the interviewing thing, it has to be more interactive. For example, we'd have to get one of the authors maybe to read something from the book or something like that, rather than asking them. What I realized making the mistake was that I was asking adult questions. I was trying to ask children's questions, but I wasn't getting it right. Yeah. She's older now to kind of ask those questions. And I think that's where we have to go, but we still stay with the 15-minute format. I keep them because I live in a rural area. It takes 7 minutes for the average person around here to get their kids to school. And, they usually do kind of carpooling. So there's 7 or 8 of them going back and forth in 2 different cars throughout the week. So our idea is get the podcast on, they'll sit and listen to it, and then they'll do it at home. So yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're going to do kids pod, it has to be swift and fast paced as well, so that kids can run with it, rather than if they sit there, they get bored, they start twiggling with their fingers or whatever, and then you've lost them. A bit like adults, really.
Nothing changes.
Exactly.
So do you have a set way that you do each show then, that you approach them? Do you do them all the same, or do you approach a different show according to what type of show it is?
Are you talking about Lydia's podcast?
Any show, any podcast that you start to be involved with, do you approach them in the same way every time? Yes.
And I think I do it for 2 reasons. Number one, it makes my brain happier. And number 2, I do like formatting. I do like the idea that people get used to a format and that they stick with that because it makes them feel comfortable. If you change too much, I think you can risk losing people. Like, for example, with the comfortable spot, I try and not ask or talk as much as I can. I try to let the guests do all the talking. And some of the people who've known me from other podcasts say, geez, you're fierce quiet. And I say, yeah, but that's the idea of the podcast. Whereas my previous podcast, I'd have been doing the classic Jeremy Paxton, but hang on a minute, hold on now. You said 5 minutes ago you're going to do this. But that's obviously a completely different type of podcast. Yeah. And then, so you can see what I was just saying. Like, I'm taking the same format that we did with the Moldovan coffee break and applying that format to the Greenland podcast because it actually suits the podcast. It works well, because we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to get people from Greenland. We're trying to get people who think they know about Greenland, or maybe they should listen to this podcast and realize that they don't know anything about Greenland. And then we want to get people who are interested in women's issues. So, the format works. You do need somebody presenting the show who is not necessarily going to give their opinion. And then you need somebody who has done the interview and has done a bit of homework on the issues and topics that were raised within that interview. So, yeah, I do like the formats. I do think they work. I listen to podcasts sometimes, and I know that they change because they probably think that their podcast is going to be, slow paced, or maybe it's running out of steam. That's absolutely fine. But I have found that podcasts, sometimes you're a little bit all over the place. One thing I don't like at all is when you listen to a podcast and then they just go straight into it. Hello, my name's John, and this is what I'm going to do today. And then the next week they have a really long intro with music. And, you're kind of sitting there going, I want to give you the chance, and I'm finding it difficult because I can't get comfortable listening to your podcast. I don't know what you're going to do. So I do like, intro music, same length of time. Yeah. Maybe that's the old school record producer in me. But, I like to have formats. I think that it makes people, they know what they're going to get. And if they're sticking with you, they're going to be happy. But my new changes along the way are okay as well. As long as you just don't go rip up the page and say, hey, today we're just going to end after 10 minutes. So that's another thing that really annoys me as well. I don't like podcast series that I listen to that are an hour and a half in one episode, and then they're 10 minutes in another, which I've seen, which I can't understand. I don't mind an hour or an hour and a half or something like that. Or actually, I don't even mind if I've done it the odd time where you might say, okay, this podcast is going on a little bit, but I'm just going to do this because the conversation is very interesting. At least you're giving your listener an opportunity. They're looking at you, they're watching, maybe they're going to work and they go, okay, I'll pause it now and I'll listen to the rest later. But then you might have some guys and girls who do podcasting and their times are all over the place. And that really wrecks my head because, you might say, I'm going to listen to this episode of The Stars at night and it's going to put me to sleep. And then suddenly after 10 minutes it's finished and you're going, huh? So I find that a little bit of organization is good. I don't know what you think. I mean, I don't know whether you do that or not.
I've had half an hour episodes, as I've mentioned before, and then I've had episodes that have gone like the Martin Ware one that went over 2 hours, just over 2 hours. But I thought that was essential to go with that, to get that background of Martin Ware. Really? Yeah, but
you see, in the podcast, you did say that, though. You see, yes. You said it twice. So you said it at the very end, the very start, that we're going to start on something here, and it's not necessarily what I intended the podcast episode to be about.
Yeah.
Then you went and you said, okay, now we're going to switch. I can't remember the exact words, but basically you told me that this podcast is going to change and it's going to be running for a little bit long. And I was happy with it. So I paused it there. And then I went back to the second part where he talked about his podcast. And, I was going, got Gary Newman. So I was like, and I was glad that I paused it there because I was getting tired. It was late at night and I wouldn't have heard that bit about Gary Newman. And I might not have gone back to the second part because time would have got ahead of me. But because you said to me, we're going to take a break here. We're not going to take it. We're going to switch the podcast. I said, okay, good time to stop. And then I was ready to listen to it the following evening. And I'm really glad I did because I got to hear that Martin Ware had Gary Newman on his podcast, So yeah, I think that's good. As long as you kind of give the listener some kind of, warning in advance or just notification that it's not normally the time I do this with, but this is kind of, I'm keeping going because I think it's worth it. And I got that from radio, actually. The way sometimes in radio, they'll say, okay, we're going to have, the show is nearly over. So we're going to have to take 2 breaks because we didn't take any breaks because that conversation was so good. I don't mind that. I don't mind listening to 5 minutes of advertisements on a radio station if it meant that the presenter had gone the extra mile just to get the better conversation because it was rolling so well. So yeah, I think it's okay. But you know what I mean about those guys just flip-flopping all over the place. They're just, that can sometimes be, you can't commit yourself to a podcast.
Hello to all of you boys next door, mums and dads, newlyweds and nearly deads. Introducing Dangerous Amusements, a brand new podcast where we talk about the music of Elvis Costello. I'm Stu Arrowsmith, and in each episode I'll be joined by a special guest to chat all things Elvis, and I'll be asking them to help me compile the ultimate Elvis Costello playlist.
So an interesting thing is that I get the impression that you have a very wide, varied taste in what you like to listen to and your forms of entertainment that you enjoy.
I think I just have an interest in pop culture. So it comes from my life as a journalist. I remember a sales guy telling me when I first started off working, and I was thinking of going doing sales, and I was working in this company, and this guy was the sales guy, and he said to me, could you do me a favor? There's a bit of merchandise. Can you go out in the car and just get that out? So I got in, and I had a lovely car. He had one of those Scorpio Granadas, and it was like, it was a perfect sales rep's car. And I sat in the front seat and I said, I had a golf or something like that. It was falling apart. So I looked, and he had a CD player. And I was like, this is like mid-90s. And I was like, Jesus, a CD player. So I had to, have to have a look and see what he's into. Of course, he had Men at Work, the bit of Slade or something like that, Iron Maiden. Then he had the Osmonds. And it was this incredibly eclectic mix. So I said, this guy's up for a slagging, So I went up to him and I said, come here. I had a look at your record collections. Absolutely dire. And he said to me, that's not my record collection. He said, that's my salesperson's record collection. I says, don't get that. And he said, well, he says, when you're talking to your guests, your customers, you have to know all about them. So I listen to some of their music, all that music, so that when I'm talking to some guy, Gary from, out in Dublin, he loves Iron Maiden, I can say to him, yeah, that's a great tune. Yeah. And I thought that's how you got to be if you want to present a very, a kind of an eclectic TV show or a radio show or podcast. Or even if you want to be a DJ, you have to kind of be able to play The Clash, and then you have to be able to play, Enya, because that's what I think a lot of people do have generally in lives are very eclectic. So when I looked at the Comfortable Spot podcast, I kind of wrote down all the people that I was interested in. Then I wrote down all of the interests that I was interested in. And I started to number them from 1 to whatever. And I found all the people I liked were from very different walks of lives. And then B, the subjects I was interested in were extremely varied. So yeah, I think it works. I think it's all about getting people who are interesting to listen to. And I think generally you'll have somebody maybe who might have listened to my interview with Matt Kaplan from the Planetary Society because they like space. They go, oh, that's a good interview. I like that. But then, they might want to listen to, say, Fergal Linehan, who talked about writing a book with the Irish president, because I think the whole standard starts to slip in. It's a bit like, Parkinson's, the original Parkinson had that ability to have people sitting there because they like to hear good conversation. And yourself, right? Good conversation is gone from TV talk shows. Yeah. Whether it's Graham Norton or Jimmy Kimmel, they're only on to promote something. They're not on to discuss them or discuss something that's on. So when you look back at Dick Cravett in America, or you look back at Parkinson, the conversations were heated, or they were kind of a bit wonky at times, but they were still great. You still look back on them and you still go, yeah, that's what actually a good conversation should be like. Because you got to make your guests feel comfortable, I think, and then you've got to be able to get something out of them. And I think Parkinson and Dick Cravett in the States had a wonderful ability to do that. He'd sometimes just sit back and let the guest waffle, and when the time was up, he'd kind of just step in very smoothly and not interject. So it's very eclectic. But there's a very famous TV show over here in Ireland called The Late Late Show. It's been running since 1963. And it's only had a couple of presenters over the years, but the most famous one was Gay Byrne. And he used to, he'd say, and, our sponsors today is, Mullahan Guest House in County Kerry. They have a beautiful hotel out there. And there's a night for everybody, and one for everybody in the audience. So I kind of always have that in my head. I always think there has to be one for everybody in the audience. The one thing I would say that I am very careful about is that I truly believe in getting a good gender balance on the actual podcast. If you do have a lot of guys, the mood could change. So I when I'm looking at my guests, I try and even that out. It's a deliberate thing. I don't feel any shame in saying that, but you have to have as many women on your podcast as men, and whatever gender people want to be. I don't know anybody in those genders, but actually I feel that I will begin to do that because I'm beginning to kind of domino effect, when you're on Twitter and you're following people and then you come across other people. So yeah, I think I constantly have that in mind more than anything else. But I don't know. Do you think, I'm curious, you have a very eclectic mix as well on your podcasts. Is that because you just have podcasts? Because it's not always podcasters, is it?
No, it's not always podcast. It started out as podcast, but then because the show is called Pods Like Us and it looks at I've sort of stretched the idea of the show in a sense to include online content providers. So now I've gone into people who provide who make videos for YouTube channels. I mean, there's some really creative people creating animation and all sorts of entertainment on the internet. And it's something that grabbed my attention over the last year or so that I've seen that. And I just thought that's something that perhaps needs to be looked into as well, because I think it's an important part of what's going on and the change in modern popular culture, basically pop culture. So I've gone into that as well, but some other areas that I go into, I've had 3 people on who don't do podcast at all, but they listen to podcast. So that's turning it on its head, and it's me asking them, why do you listen to podcast? And what are you actually looking for in a podcast? So then that turns it so that us as we as podcasters can listen to that. And it's sort of teaching us and showing us what they're looking for. But I'm always trying to look at different ways of going into that subject of online, entertainment.
Yeah. What amazes me is the commitment, and you know this, right? Yeah. Of some podcasters who do these they indulge in a hobby or they indulge in some kind of theme. And I kind of get to myself, how are you able to do this? I really don't know how you're able to have the commitment to do it. Like, we watched silly movies, or we watched, movies made by Francis Ford Coppola backwards. And you're kind of going, okay, that's kind of really funny. And actually, stupid blokes tend to be into that sort of thing. I think pop culture when it comes to girls is very different to pop culture when it comes to guys. We always tend to do those ridiculous things. How many burgers can I eat watching Psycho? And it's all this kind of thing. They add this extra envelope to it. It's like the risk they're taking that you used to take when you were kids, which, by the way, I think why a lot of lads love Stranger Things on Netflix, because it reminds them so much of being idiots like some of the characters in that show. Yeah. So I don't know how people can do that, because my concept's really easy. It's just, who do I like? Will I shout out to them? Will they say yes? And if they say yes, when can they chat? So, I don't really have to do that much kind of deep thought. I just kind of know I have the advantage already because I like this person. I may only like them because I've read books they like, and they could turn out to be an absolute plonker. But at the end of the day, I kind of have the experience not to let that happen. So I think every podcast I've ever done has been successful. It hasn't been a stonker where I said I can't publish that, because I don't let it happen. I make sure that it goes down a certain road. And that comes with experience, obviously. But yeah, again, some people, like, you listen to these podcasts and they're challenging their guests, and I'm going, I'd never have the balls to do that, No. Because I always think, are you going to walk out halfway through the podcast or whatever? So again, maybe you've listened to a lot of American podcasts. Maybe it's an American way of doing things. I don't know. See, us Irish people are not very confrontational in that respect. When it comes to what I do, there are a few podcasts out there that are very popular, and I think they all tend to run down this route of being nice and wanting to be liked, by both the audience and the guest. Whereas, in America, there are people who love themselves and their own podcast, and the guests are just this existential aspect of them, and they could do without the guest if they really wanted to.
Absolutely, definitely. I'll switch light on so you can see me.
Yeah, I'm turning into Andrew Ridley here with the tan. Yeah. So yeah, it's great. I mean, I do enjoy it now, I mean, the thing is, I suppose it's like everything else. If the one thing I would give people advice is if you're passionate about it, stick with it. Don't get disheartened by figures. I think podcasters are over fascinated by viewing figures or, listening figures and stuff like that. I sometimes it gets to me as well. I think I go, I wish more people had heard that podcast. But you kind of have to say to yourself, there's a million podcasters out there. And if you can get, I've even said this, if you can get 10 people to listen to your podcast, because of the sheer population figures in the world, there is the potential to get 1,000. You just have to kind of stick at it. And another thing I'd probably say is, unless you have to, don't try and date your podcasts. So what I try and do with each episode, I don't try and talk about too many relevant things that are happening at that time of the recording. Because I think that what that does is, from an archive point of view, it still makes your podcasts interesting. So I think if anybody has a topic or a subject to cover, be it history or rock music, whatever, they have the advantage in that their you can go back to their podcast. Like you, I can went back to your podcasts, and I didn't sit there and go, this is too outdated, I don't want to hear it. So I think that's an advantage. So if you're going to pick a topic to do, unless you're really into, say, current affairs or something like that, I think it's best to stay away from something that will date your podcast too quickly. Because then what happens is if somebody discovers your podcast and they start listening to it, they're going to go back and listen to all the other episodes. And I think that's really good because then your numbers go up all the time. But like I said, I'm not really that fascinated by numbers. I never have. I think it's all about personal achievement. And, look, if I never did a podcast ever again, I could still turn around and say, I did an interview with Midge Ure, who was one of my idols. And every bloke in my class would go, wow. And that's that talking, that pub, that bar stool talking moment when the lads are saying, oh, you know what? I was in a pub there last week and I saw Conor McGregor across there. And he waved at me. And I said, well, I was talking to Midge Ure last week, and they're going like, what? So that if I never do a podcast again, I get that moment and I could say, well, that was a great moment. So I think that's why, you should have that in mind when you're doing a podcast. You should say more than anything else, I think it should be a personal fulfillment. You should enjoy doing it. Don't do it because you think you should do it, or definitely don't think you're doing it because you're going to make money from it, because you're not. You're never going to do that unless you really hit the jackpot, and you've got to work really hard on that. And, that's, you've probably got to be lucky and all those other things have to fall into place. But don't think that's, if you're going in there, you're going, like I've had a few guys saying to me, I think I want to make a few bob on the side. Should I do a podcast? And I said, no, just get an extra job. You're better off being you'd have more luck being a golf coach than you would be,
You're not even going to make enough money from advertising to live off it.
No. And it's just, it shouldn't be one of your motivations, actually. I think it should be nothing. I don't think it should be at all. If you want to make money from social media, you need to do something else. You need to be an influencer or whatever, or actually just work in social media, but no, podcasting is not something that, look, at the end of the day, I actually get a few jobs doing editing because people come to me and say, oh, I have this podcast. I've recorded it. It's in rag order and I don't know how to fix it. And I say, give it to me. I'll sort it out. And, I might get a few quid off that. And then they might come to me and say, could you do the next 5? Because people get incredibly lazy because they realize, oh, whoa, do I have to do this or do I have to do that? And I say, yeah, I can do it. So, that's probably a better avenue for me to make it maybe career out of this than say me just getting money from my podcasts. But I would like people to maybe consider me as somebody who can probably put together a decent podcast. And I think if I was going to do anything else, bar the Comfortable Spot or maybe Lydia's podcast, that's where I'll probably go. I'll probably actually just start producing podcasts for other people and saying, look, some kind of partnership or stuff like that. Because, I have the equipment and so on. I say, and yourself, it's not that you don't need a 15 grand mixing desk to do it, or you don't need to have the latest Adobe software. You've really just got 2 people talking. And if you can't get a nice sound out of that, well, then you need to take up gardening or something like that.
Recently taken up gardening, actually, for the first time ever, but that's a tangent.
There you go.
I've got an SM58 that's running through an old 4-track Tascam tape recorder.
I was just going to say,
my computer.
Tape on it. I used to have one. Yes. I sold it for 50 quid in 1998.
Yes, I do use the tape cassette still.
Wow. That's pop culture stuff. That's the thing. I came from that background. So digitally, I had an idea Cubase, but I was from reel to reel background. And but having said that, I think the technology jump is great. Look, I have a Zoom. I have a Rodecaster Pro, and it's just amazing. And I have colleagues of mine who I'm in kind of group chats with them, and there's now a Rodecaster Pro 2, and they're like, oh, I can't wait for the Rodecaster Pro 2. And I'm kind of saying to them, what was wrong with the Rodecaster Pro 1? So I'm not a geek. I don't go out and buy the latest stuff. Like I have a Rode pod mic, but I also have stuff like, this fella here, which is in case I break down. That's like a USB mic. And then I have a Zoom H1, which is like this little handheld thing. And I've used that in a podcast. And then I have the H6, the Zoom H6. They're all brilliant. And you don't need to spend 500 quid to do a podcast.
No.
Content is king. That's what I always say to people. Your content is king. I was asked to edit this podcast before for this. I won't say the organization, but it was one of these non-profit organizations based in France. And they were doing an English podcast. And they were interviewing people on the streets. And it was just very artistic. And it was really boring. And I was kind of going, this is just so boring. No one's going to listen to this. Like, because they were asking them really existential questions. Like, how do you feel about the sun today? I was like, it's like, I said, I said, look, if you're going to do something like that, you probably need to do it visually, because, you want to see the person. You might find them attractive or you might find them whatever, but you have to have that extra bit. And, they even said to me, well, we have this intro. And I said, okay, well, what is it? 20 seconds? You can't have anything more than 30 seconds. And they were like, oh no, it's a minute and a half. It's a violin solo by one of our members here. And I was like, okay, I'll just put it together and you can see what you can do, So I just think sometimes you can have but having said that, it was all, I produced it as best I could. It was a very good quality production. And it was still extremely boring. Like, before you even got to the content of the podcast, you had like 2 minutes of this music. And like I was saying, no one's going to listen. Just, yourself, no one's going to listen to that. A really good podcast, in my opinion, has to have something that goes to the subject matter fairly quickly, whether it's an introduction on you or an introduction on what you're doing. But if you have this 1.5 minute solo, not everybody likes a violin solo as well. It's not like you're doing a piece that people are going to like, like the Monkees or Led Zeppelin or even Go West. You have to have something that people will go, while they're listening, I like that. Yep. Yeah, it's a good tune. And then the podcast starts, So yeah, I think people can have these ideas in their head, but if your content isn't good, it's good how well produced it is. But I don't know, you listen to a lot of podcasts. Is quality a real thing for you? I don't know. I tend to feel it is, maybe. The production quality, or does that bother you when you're listening to a podcast?
I think so. I think sometimes I'll listen to shows and I've not pulled them up for it, but you'll find that they don't look at the levels of each person, for instance, which really irritates me, because you'll have someone who's all the way up there and then you'll have someone that you're struggling to hear. And it's not like I'm changing. I can't change the volume of it while I'm driving a van.
Yeah.
I can't suddenly go, I can't. He's starting to talk. I'll turn the volume up. So I'll turn that up. No, I won't, because I'm driving a van. And so, which is an easy fix, because you can actually get software to do it. And if you can get different, it's better if you get a different sound from each person. But even if you don't, you're still software that you can use that will level all of the sound throughout the whole episode. But these things, I will say as a suggestion to people, if you use this software, do so, but then when you come into the mix stage, knock it down by about 3 or something, because it puts it up to the loudest that it can be, and then you get a problem with distortion then when you listen to it on your device.
Yeah. For example, if you have somebody, I had one guest everything, he was on a phone, so like the quality wasn't good, but I decided I could hear every word. And then what I did was I gave it to my wife and I said, can you hear everything she's saying? And she said, yeah. Does it bother you that it's kind of phone? She goes, no, actually, I kind of like that. It's kind of old fashioned. That's nice. So I think, people are generally used to that, especially our generation, maybe. We're used to that when you listen to a radio station that somebody's talking on a phone. And as you say, it's about having clarity rather than volume. Because if I had turned the volume up on it anymore, it would have become blurry and then they wouldn't have been able to hear what she was saying. So I decided at a very early point, she didn't have the equipment to do it. And I said, right, we'll just do it on the phone. And, it kind of a little bit old fashioned actually for me, but I was happy with that, and I said, that's fine, because people are used to that type of sound in their ear. I mean, you and I were old enough to remember when football was being played in international countries, the commentators did it on the phone. They phoned it in. So you always had that lovely sound that people like my age would love to hear again on listening. I'd love that when you look back on, Notts Forest winning the European Cup, Martin Chivers or whoever is doing the commentary on the phone and talking like this. It's brilliant. I used to love that. Because it gave
Nigel Clough has gone in for a goal.
Yeah, it was fresh, and that's the thing. So I decided that I would leave that rather than saying to her, okay, you need to go off and get a microphone and do all this type of thing. So I think once people can hear what the guest is saying without an obstruction or some kind of distortion, it's fine. But yeah, definitely quality, levels can be an issue. And that was something that I had when I started off, because I was used to music. And, when you're doing recording music, each instrument has a different level. So, and you already know what those levels are, unless you're dealing with somebody who's a heavy drummer or whatever. And then vocals were never louder than the music. What you did was you got the vocals to a point where the vocals were fine, and you mix down the music to around the vocals. It's called a pyramid thing.
Yeah.
But with podcasting, it's different because people shout sometimes and they talk loud, or they might go to a moment where they go, "Wow," and this kind of thing. So, yeah, it is a balancing act, but you can. The thing is to make life easier for yourself, as you said there, rather than leaving it to the software to help you. And if you can get them to understand, or you can get them to do whatever you can to make their sound as best as you can, well, then you're making life easier and you don't have to rely on software. I sometimes find I really get frustrated if I have to do a really heavy mix down. I prefer to do something that I've already sorted out in the chat beforehand, or maybe talk to them a week before. I try and do that with my guests. I try and talk to them using the same system, but not a recording session. So I can get an idea of how they talk, what kind of levels they use, and what kind of equipment they have. And then I can make a decision on it based on that,
Yep. You also sometimes have problems when you have guests who don't know how to use a microphone, for instance. So they might be, this is just for an effect, so they might be all the way up, they might be too close to the microphone, or they might be so far away that you're going to have an enormous echo in the background.
Yeah. Or they sometimes have a laptop with a fan that's like a jumbo jet.
Yes. Or they'll use the microphone on the laptop.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big no-no. Actually, and to be honest with you, I generally, if that comes to the point, I'll generally say to them, if I can, I'll meet them. I'll say, look, I'll meet you because your sound is not good enough. And you'd be amazed as well. Like, to be like, it hasn't personally happened to me, but I've been handed recordings where somebody would say to me, can you do anything with that? And I'd say, okay, what is it? And it's like a journalist or somebody who works on the radio, and the equipment they have at home is dire. And you'd say to yourself, God, you think they'd know a bit more, wouldn't you? It was kind of surprising. Or it might be a musician, and like, what? Why didn't they? They could have at least tried to do a better job than that. So yeah, but it hasn't personally happened to me, thankfully. The law of averages says it must, because when you're doing a podcast episode every week, you're going to get a howler. But the thing is, that's why I generally try and do 5 or 6 recorded. Like, I have a couple recorded well in advance, so I can kind of go, okay, till I sort that out, I can put that one there. Rather than, as you're hanging on your next podcast. Don't ever do that, because I always see that on Twitter. Sorry, we're a bit late with our podcast this week because A, B, and C happened. If you're going to be committed to the project, don't do that. Have 4 or 5 recorded in advance so you can work your way around when you have an issue. If you're in hospital or you're on holidays, the 2 H's. That's the thing you can do. And that's the beauty as well of using those podcast platforms, that you can schedule everything. It's really handy. You can just walk away and let it do its thing. That's what I like about it. But yeah, if you prepare to fail or fail to prepare, whatever. Roy Keane said that one time. I don't know what he said, but that's something like that.
That's a very good philosophy to follow.
G'day. This is Matty C from the Astros Fantasy Football Podcast, way down in Australia. And we love getting to listen to Marv meet new podcasters from all over the world here on the Pods Like Us podcast.
So, touching on something that you've mentioned a bit ago, the music. I mean, I've actually made a change with my own music recently, because my opening music used to be around a minute long or just over a minute. So what I did instead is I've recently cut that down to the last 10 seconds of the piece, which is sort of like a close off. So it's just the electric guitars doing their bit for 10 seconds. And that's an introduction. And then it's still got its 30-second ending music as well, because I sort of got that impression that it's almost as though people are waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting for the show to start. It needs a sort of introduction. So what me and yourself do is, with the music there, the beginning and the end, it's almost like we're treating it like a book or a magazine, where you open it up and you have the front cover and you have the back cover or whatever, and then you open it up, and then you have the story and that inside. So what do you think is the importance of music and, say, in some shows, sound effects and transitional effects, and of logos for shows?
I think they're all really important. It amazes me that some people like to do a really good podcast with really good quality guests and great content, and then they don't make it attractive. They don't give people add-ons. They don't wrap their podcast.
Yeah.
They don't package it properly. Music for me, if you listen to the podcast that I've done, I've tried to make the music as coherent with the subject matter. So when we did Eurochat, we were an Irish podcaster. So we went for this kind of this U2-ish style of music.
Yeah.
We went like it's very U2, kind of right around the time of 1990, Unforgettable Fire, heavy kind of strat, And then for the Moldovan coffee break, we used it was not really a Eastern European, but more of a Turkish Mediterranean Black Sea sort of thing, because Moldova was kind of around that area. You have Ukraine, Moldova, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. So we went with this Black Sea style of music, and then we used that. And then with the Comfortable Spot, I tried to give that kind of a cafe jazzy type thing, because we do actually like that music. I know it kind of gets slagged a bit, but I think that's nice because I want to ease people in. My podcast should be listened to in the evening when the kids are in bed or whatever. And that's why I'm trying to do that music. And like you say, timing is everything, really. Sometimes though, if it's a bit longer, it's cool. Like I loved our Eurochat team because it was really good. It was this, and everybody was kind of going, yeah, I love that. Is that you too? And it's going, no, it's not you too. But it was like, I got it from one of these, you pay for the royalty of the use of track. I think it was called Dublin. The song was called Dublin. So I was like, yeah, that's you too. So, I think it's important that you try and get your music to match your podcast. Like if you're going to do a scary podcast, you should definitely have some kind of Mike Oldfield's don't do Thriller, even though it's like about horror, it's Quincy Jones. It's not going to set the mood right, or, if you're going to do a current affairs program, don't go down the road of news at 10, because that's too newsy and that puts people off, because it makes you sound like an arrogant bee. People are, yeah, this is Johnson, and it's like, people aren't going to like that. They think you're too up your own backside. You got to have something that's attractive to music. And sometimes you'd be amazed. I go on to those free sites where you pay like $5 and you get the royalty sheet that you can use it. And I like supporting young musicians like that, lads who are, you can see, you go to their website and they've got like so many different types of theme musics for everything. And you just pick it and you pay your, whatever they ask you, €5-10. It's nothing. But the great thing is you get versions of it then. You can get a short version or a long version. So I'm pretty good at slicing and dicing when it comes to that. But I do like to have shorter version. And I'll pay the extra money for that, because if it means that I can get a 30-second one and then a minute long, they can be very handy to use, So yeah, it is. Your second thing about logos, I'm terrible at logos, actually. Yeah. I wish I could do better at that, but I'm not very creative. So I think some of the logos I've done haven't been great. Like the Comfortable Spot is okay. It's kind of like this, I asked the ladies in my life what they thought of it, and they kind of said, oh yeah, it's lovely and very colorful. Then some lad said it's like IKEA, so I was like, okay, you can't win, So and then I think the best logo I did was with the Moldovan coffee break. So what we did was we got the colors of Moldova, which are red, yellow, and blue. I had a red coffee, cup of coffee there. I had a kind of the blue, the right, and the title name was in blue, and then the yellow was in for the title name, and then the blue was the kind of the rest. So what I did was I have my kitchen worktop, which is kind of like this wooden theme. So I just stood up on a stair and got my camera and just got right over it, done it straight over, snapped a shot, and I thought it worked okay. It looked good, It wasn't. I'm sure it's Andy Warhol would have kicked up a fuss, but yeah, I do think podcast logos are good. The only thing I would say is don't use a microphone in your logo. I see that a lot, and I kind of go, I don't think that does anything for a podcast, because people are already there it's already a podcast. They know it's a podcast. So they want to maybe get an idea of what the podcast is about. So if you are going to do a logo or do an image for your podcast, try and have it that, it could be like, for example, you're podcasting, you're doing a podcast about podcasting. So you have the earphones, and I think, that's a great idea because you're listening, right? You're not necessarily, because if you have a microphone, then it's all about you, which is not what your podcast is about. But I think if you're going to have a logo, it should be about as close to what your podcast is about, rather than having people, treating people for fools and saying, this is a podcast because it's got a podcast mic on it. And that's the only advice I would give. But whereas it comes to logos, I'm the worst person to ask. So probably better off interviewing. Next interview, you'll have to interview somebody who's an expert in that. That I would actually love to listen to that podcast because I'd love to learn a little bit more. I'm a total dunce on it,
Yeah. I actually like the picture that you've done for the Moldovan coffee break.
I'm on the light here as well. Hang on.
Okay, but I like that picture that you've done with the coffee cup, the Zoom recorder, and then the notebook and the pen there, and the name of the European network, and then the title. It says it all about the show.
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Subliminally, there's the colors there as well from Moldova. We tried to figure out some way of putting the flag in it, but then I thought, that's not going to work because people will think it's Romania, because the flag is very similar to Romania. So, you'll have smart artists coming on saying, you've got the flag of Romania up there. And I'd say, I have to go into this argument where I'll say, no, we don't have the flag of Romania. So I said, I'm not going to go there. So I thought of, subliminal, just putting in the colors. So I think that is the best thing I've done. I mean, Lydia's one is very straightforward. I think if you're going to have a podcast, you need Lydia there.
Yeah.
And up to a certain point, Lydia wasn't seen on the podcast. We didn't show her face, but she kicked up too much of a stink and she was 9. So I said, right, it's time for the great reveal. So, we changed the podcast with her face on it. And that really works. It's got this kind of kiddie style writing. Not much to do there because she sells the podcast. But yeah, I do agree. I do think the logo is very important. And if you do have a budget, get somebody professional to do your logo.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. I was incredibly lucky with that because my other half, Louise, came up with the idea for that, for the Pods Like Us logo, which I thought was a great idea. And then Gil, who does the show Mindbuzz, he said to me, he says, I've got my friend who's a professional artist who does logos. And he's done you a version of it, and you can have it for free. And of course, you never look a gift horse in the mouth. You take the offers that are there, and it is a good logo. I was really lucky with that.
Well, it's colorful. It depends on. I think the themes are very important. Sometimes you can think that's going to be a great idea, and it's not. Like, for example, I saw a podcast recently about murders unsolved, and it's just a big bloody knife on it. And I mean, I wasn't using that. I was using the actual word. It was bloody. And I was saying to myself, Jesus, I'd never look at that. That would be a real podcast put off. Because I go, is this guy kind of thinking? You know what I mean? So I never went around to listen to that podcast, and I'm not really up on them anyway. But if anything, I would like to have, if it's going to have, a logo about kind of unsolved mysteries, you need to think a little bit outside the box, and you need to be a bit more careful. But you see, that's the thing. Like, if I would say, if somebody asked me, would I suggest for a sports podcast, I wouldn't have a clue, because I'd be going from stuff like that was in Shoot. So I'd be saying, do a cover of Shoot. That's only because as I said, the maniac for pop culture. Whereas young kids probably would think that was rubbish. So I don't have a clue. So maybe my advice is get a professional, or you get a young guy, kid, teenager to do it for you, because he's going to do it 10 times better than you are. Just make sure he doesn't use some photocopy or some copyrighted photograph in your way in a hack. But it's, as I said, if you have with today's modern phones, I mean, I used my SLR camera to get that. But my wife's phone could probably do a decent enough job to do that picture for the Moldovan coffee break. So kids nowadays are so creative that they can do things. So if you have a younger cousin or something, tell them what your podcast is about and ask them to do a logo. I guarantee they'll have something better than any of us old farts could ever do, So yeah. But I think you should do an episode on that, That would be brilliant, actually. I think you'd have loads of people really taking advice from that one. So there must be somebody out there who's listened to this who'd be happy to step in, or maybe a podcast that you like their logo. See if they can do it,
I've actually started to arrange a group chat of people who make logos for a living for podcast.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I thought that was a good idea a long while ago. And then, so going from that, you've got the logo and the music and the structure of the shows that you make and the subject of each of the shows. Then you go into promotion. So there's a whole other kettle of fish right there with promotion.
Yeah, I think you're just getting that baseball and you just get on the biggest ferry crossing the Irish Sea and you're throwing the baseball, hoping it's going to hit the Isle of Man. That's what promoting a podcast is like. You just don't know there's nothing set in stone. There's no book on it. There's no, fact sheet. There's not even a guy out there that knows what he's talking about.
No. Because
it depends on so many factors. It depends on the time you put into it, your subject matter, who you know. Are you really liked? Do people like you? You could be an idiot on Facebook or Twitter, and people just generally don't like you. So there's just so many factors, and I just don't think about it. To be honest, I spend a lot of time on Twitter. So for me, Twitter has been my base of operations. Even if it's a bit like trying to invade France while you're stationed on the moon. Unless you're moon Nazis, it's not going to work. It's going to be an extremely difficult effort, So I'm not sure even Twitter is the best way to do it. I've tried Instagram, but I can't get into the vibe of it. I end up looking at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and I can't get wrapped around it. I think Instagram is more effective for Lydia because Lydia's a kid. She's more visual. So when I take pictures of Lydia in the zoo, people love that because it's cute and it's funny and it's completely topical for what she does. So Lydia's podcast doesn't necessarily have to be about books when she's promoting it. It's really about her.
Yep.
So with me, it's not really about me because the idea is that I'm just in the background asking the questions. It's all about the guests. So maybe I'm doing it wrong, but it's the only way I know. But I still enjoy doing it. I still get the excitement. Like I've just uploaded a podcast tonight. So I'm excited about putting it up on Twitter. And even if I get 10 likes or 100 likes, it's great. But I will say this, and this is the most important thing you can ever do when you're interviewing guests, right? Do not, under any circumstances, rely on the guest to promote your podcast. It's not fair and it's not right.
No.
It doesn't matter how famous they are, right? They're not there to make you famous. Only Simon Cowell will do that, and there's a price to pay. So, it's not fair. It doesn't matter who they are. You should be able to do it sufficiently enough for it to work.
Yeah.
Like, for example, my biggest listened podcast. Go ahead,
I was going to say...
My biggest listened podcast is Mid-Jure.
Yes.
Because it's Mid-Jure.
Yeah.
Not because Mid-Jure promoted it.
It's the person that you've got as a guest that pulls, in those circumstances, that pulls the audience. It's not your show initially that does that in that sort of show.
Yeah.
Whereas I've got this strange thing with my own show where I'm trying to push shows to get them new listeners, but to introduce them to them. It's sort of a back and forth. But at the same time, it's the whole format of my show that should be pushing that. In a sense,
Absolutely.
And it grows over time. All these shows, essentially, what we've been saying frequently throughout this discussion between us is you'll get there, but it takes time. You won't get there straight away unless you're a Joe Rogan and you've got this audience already there. But none of us that are doing these sort of shows are of that sort of professional ilk.
Yes. And you have to be a certain character as well, because I mean, look, if you're out today, like I get lots of people contacting my show to be guests on my show, mostly American people who have self-help books, or John was an addict for 25 years. Now he's a preacher and he has really a lot to tell. None of that. They just don't get my podcast. They're just doing that. They're like, they're like a pigeon, letting go a load of carrier pigeons across the internet and just hoping one lands in the right box. they don't even care about what my podcast. They've done no research. So if they did, they'd know A, they're not suitable, and B, they're just not, I don't know them. So the whole idea of my podcast is that I like them as, people, or I might be fascinated by what they do. There has to be something, but I just won't take somebody blindly. So, that's the first thing. And the second thing is, as I said, with guests, you can't expect guests to promote your podcast, but also, you have to bear in mind that sometimes you might have to go out of your comfort zone if it means getting somebody who would be good for your podcast.
Yeah.
So, it's all like, for example, this, right? What if you go off and do something else, right? So you go off and do something else, and then you come back to them and they say, it's still not good enough. But then you go to another record company and they say, your first song is great, but your second one is terrible, right? So it's all open to interpretation. But what you have to do is you use those things to learn, and you also use them as stepping stones. But don't kind of go against your own, your conscience, your podcasting conscience. You will have to get people sometimes that maybe you don't really know much about or you don't really like. But if they're good for your podcast, if they give your podcast a bit of stature, you should do that. But don't do it all the time. Don't go against your principles. Like, I could probably go outside and, and get loads of people, but I probably wouldn't enjoy talking to them. And they might bring me more listeners, but I'm not getting that out of it. And then the issue is you get bored, as you get tired, you get frustrated, and then you don't go with the program. So don't let things don't get the run of yourself. Again, we're going back to the same thing, aren't we? More listeners, more rating, and then in some cases, more money. That's the last. Podcasting is a little bit like doing that painting that's going to make you a lot of money. It's most likely you're going to be dead by the time it starts making money, because actually the fact that you died has made it more valuable. Yep. So, podcasting is a little bit like that, and that you have to be really patient and just realize that it might not never work. I've about 40 tracks, 50 tracks of songs that only my 9-year-old daughter loves, but she plays them all day. She plays them more than I've ever even heard them. And she says, Dad, why don't you go and sing this song, Mary? And I go, because that was 30 years ago. But it's great that she plays them. But I didn't force them on her. She just said, what's all these CDs? And I said, you can have a listen to them if you want. So podcasting is a little bit like that. I kind of think of my podcasting, and actually with even all the other projects I've done, in a sense, there's some kind of archive thing that people can go back and listen to if they want to, whether it's 2 years from now or a year from now or whatever. It doesn't really matter, as long as people enjoy what they listen to. So yeah, I think it's, as you said there, it's a really long process.
You've reminded me, there's a work colleague who started with the company about 7 months ago. And for some reason, he sort of like approached me and he said to me, he said, I found some of your music online. This is from back in the day when I used to do music. And he says, what were you thinking when you did this, and this, and he's bringing up these things. And I'm thinking, and I'm saying to him, I don't remember. I said, that's like 15 years ago, nearly 20 years ago. Yeah. I have no idea where I was back then because I'm a completely different person now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the Ricky Gervais incident, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember when I was in school and there was a band called Naked Eyes, and they did that song, Always Something There to Remind Me. Yeah. And it was one, your man Simon Climby, actually. They came Climby Fisher and had a few hits as well in the 90s. Yeah. But I remember I had this smash hits kind of book, which I kept from 1983. And it had in it, the top 10, who's going to be big in 85 or something. And I remember Naked Eyes. I was looking back on it. And this was like about 10, 12 years ago. And Ricky Gervais' band was in it. I can't think of what the name of them were. But I was sitting there going, that doesn't even look like Ricky Gervais. Like, you couldn't even look, if he was like, never said anything about the fact that he was in that band, no one would have noticed. It's not like you look at someone and you go, oh, look, there's a young, whatever, George Clooney, and the thing is, it is the Ricky Gervais thing, because when you look, he does talk about it the odd time, but no one puts it together and says that, oh, that was ideally going to happen. No one's going to say, okay, you knew when he was in that band in the 1980s, trying to be a cross between David Bowie and, whatever, that he was going to end up being this, this writer of this award-winning sitcom. It's never going to happen. So yeah, it's exactly what happened to you. That's, you're just, no one's going to add that together. However, some people, being Ireland, people still add that together. I still get text message from saying, "Here, Sweeney, are you not doing the local pub anymore? Now you're doing podcasting." So it's a smaller country, so we still get that in the ear, you know. So that does happen to Irish people, yeah. But no, I agree with what you're saying. It's a different world.
Hey, it's Gil from
The Mind Podcast.
today's Mind Culture and Social podcast, and you're listening to Pods Like Us.
So where do you stand on the whole idea of changing a formula of a show? Are you for, I think we touched on it a little bit earlier on actually, but it's a difficult thing, isn't it? Changing a formula of a show. You can understand if you start a show that there will over time possibly be a slight change in some ways over time. But I mean, I'm one that's not for dramatic change from one to the other, like you were saying earlier on. So what do you think of the whole idea of changing formulas?
I think it depends on what you're getting out of it. Like, again, I keep saying this, just put the numbers aside. Don't change your show because it's not getting great numbers. You know, you could end up doing it in the nude and it still might not get great numbers. So put that aside, right? That's nothing you've no control over. You've no control over that unless you're willing to spend 10 grand in Google ads and all that kind of thing. And you're not going to get your 10 grand back, by the way. Yep. You're not going to control it. So that you have to put that aside first. So the other thing is, if you're not enjoying what you're doing, then yeah, by all means, change the format. But give people a bit of a warning. Maybe change it subtly. Don't suddenly go, you know, we've had a current affairs program and now it's suddenly going to be lighthearted banter with lesbians. You know, you can't do that. It's just not going to work. You're going to lose every single person. You know, I find is a good way of testing the audience is that you do bonus podcasts. Yeah. So let's just say, for example, you have a one-on-one and you're talking about a subject. So maybe your bonus podcast be having 4 people together and having a joint conversation. Or you might just have a bonus podcast where you're tackling a topic that you don't normally tackle. So that can give you a little bit of feedback. The advantage of a bonus podcast, again, is that people know it's a bonus podcast, so they're going to commit to it, knowing that it's probably a one-off that they might not like, but it's not going to affect their overall feelings about the show. And also, sometimes you might be mentally unable to kind of keep that going. You might want to change. I'm a little bit like that. That's why I was saying to you earlier on, for me, the comfortable spot podcast is a move away from what I've always done and continue to do outside of it. You know, your chat was great. It was getting me up to 1,000 listeners. And, you know, we were tackling all sorts of issues. We were interviewing politicians, you know, political thinkers and all that kind of thing. But my chair was getting really itchy as I was doing episode 18 of your chat, you know, and I'm kind of going, I want to do something else here. I'm bored. And that's my problem. I get bored. I kind of go, I know I can do something better than this. So then I get this idea into my head. Why don't I do this? Or why don't we do Euroscience? You know, and we did Euroscience for a while and that was great. We loved that. But again, that's kind of going, don't know. So I think if you have an itchy bum a bit like me and you kind of, that's fine as well. But you need to end your podcast properly. You know, you need to say, okay, guys, we're going to, you know, take a break for a few months. We'll be back with season 2 and then try something else in the meantime. And if you don't like that, you go back to what you already have. So, you know, I see that a lot with people and I think that's okay. But then, as you know, there are people who just start, we've been doing our podcast, episode 199. And I'm kind of going, I don't know. Don't think I could do 199 podcasts, you know? So it depends. But maybe if you have something like what I have is where you have this one that's running continuously all along. And then you have your other ones that you're kind of dipping in and out by 6 episodes or 10 episodes. I kind of think with the podcasting nowadays, everybody's really got such a short ear, as I call it. They're listening to a podcast for the first 5 minutes. So I think you should do what Netflix does and just have your, because you and I are all done. When we watch Star Trek, The Next Generation, or YE50, they were 20 episodes long, right? So now you look at Star Trek or you look at any of the Netflix short, they're 7 or 8 episodes long. Even stuff like, which I kind of think is a really clever, if not crazy move. You look at Star Wars, for example, which is like a money bag. You know, it's like stick Star Wars on it, and yet they only do 8 episodes. for all of their ones, and the Marvel ones as well, 8 episodes. Now, my kid's kicking up a stink at the end. She's going, "Why? I want more." But I'm an adult, and I kind of go, that kind of works because it gives you ground to do lots more, and vary across the board, mix the episodes together. And I think people should consider that for their podcasting. They should do 6 or 7 episodes if they're tackling a topic, rather than just go with it and then wonder how you get on. Because sometimes if you can say to a person, "This is a series of podcasts or 6 series episodes," people go, "Okay, I'm going to commit to that. I'm going to sit back and listen to that." And again, it's going back to the content is king. So you got to do a lot of work at the start. Rushing into a podcast, I think, is crazy. You got to listen to other podcasts. You got to listen to other podcasts that are on the same topic that you are. You got to look at the way they do it. And then you got to look and see if there's a different way of doing it that could be more attractive. And, maybe a short podcast would work. So yeah, that's my six cents on it. I think it's down to the individual and what they want to get out of the podcast.
Well, that next point on the bullet points, number 10, I've already ticked off because we've given people. I've got advice from you all the way through. That's what the whole episode has been getting advice from you about podcasting. So where can people find you and get hold of you then, Ken?
Okay, there's probably 2 ways. If you go to the europeannetwork.eu, you'll see all the podcasts there. You just click on the tab and all of the podcasts that I've done with them is there. There's about 40 episodes, I think. And as I say, they're broken into each series I've done. So when you go onto the tab of the website and click on podcast, you'll see each podcast series is broken down there. Have a listen and see what you think. And then I have the Comfortable Spot, which is thecomfortablespot.com. And all the episodes are there. But you can find it anyway. You can always, as you say, I hate using this phrase. I don't know where it's come from. Maybe you can tell me. But, you can get it wherever you choose to download your podcasts. So that's really, Lydia's Booktastic podcast. It's so unique that when you Google Lydia's Booktastic, it comes up straight away because I don't think anybody else is Lydia and has a Booktastic thing. So that you can find as well. So that's I'm really easy to find. I'm on Twitter as well. I have a Twitter profile for the Comfortable Spot, and then I have a Twitter profile of me, which I'm very argumentative, very political, do a lot of stuff that I would never do on a podcast. So if you're prepared to listen to me ranting, that's where you'll find me. I don't do Facebook anymore, by the way. Facebook's a waste of time. So so it's Twitter or on my websites.
That's great. Anyway, thank you for speaking with me today, Ken. This has been lots of fun. Yeah,
it was an absolute pleasure. I didn't think we were going to talk so long, but this is what happens, I suppose.
Yes.
So so thanks a million, and best of luck to all of the podcasters out there, and hopefully they can get some information for this crazy fool.
I'm sure you've given us lots of great information, I think there. Anyway, thank you, everyone. You can find Pods Like Us on Twitter, Instagram, and believe it or not, TikTok as well.
Brave man.
I'm trying. And you can contact us through podslikeus@gmail.com. Anyway, thank you, everyone, for listening, and hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us.
This is B. Nicole from Buried on the Tundra, and you're listening to Pods Like Us.